Today I'm going to break down the editing in Moon's intro for his video titled The Secret Company That Will Own Your House in 5 Years. The programs used will be Adobe Premiere Pro, Photoshop and After Effects. I'll play the clip now.
In the US alone, 70% of people who want to buy a home can't even afford to anymore. In the UK, home affordability is at its worst point since the 19th century. And
the first step is to download a YouTube video of a US flag blowing and import this onto the first video layer. Then download a tiny square pattern. I couldn't find the exact one, but any pattern will work. You can change the blend mode to multiply. Moon will most likely have access to a lot of stock footage and overlays or have them made from scratch, but we'll just use some basic ones found on Google Images or YouTube for now. Next, I'm going to hand draw these shadow shapes using the pen tool and change the fill color to black under Essential Graphics. Then hold down Alt and duplicate this layer a few times in position. You can do about a dozen of these, then nest all of them into one layer and then scale it up to make the lines really big and rotate it to match. You can play around with the opacity and blend mode to get a similar overlay. For example, opacity at 30% and blend mode as multiply. You can put the pattern on the second layer and then these shadow shapes on the third layer. We now have 3 basic background assets. Then I've created a mask around the house image from his video and done an in-point frame hold. Then I shorten all images to be 8.40 seconds, then select all, right click, replace with After Effects composition. Now for things like articles and graphs with a transparent background, these things are created by hand using the original articles. To find the same ones as Moon, I was able to Google any sentence from the graph or article and find the original. The graph was located on Google Images. Next, I import these images into After Effects, and using the pen and text tool I can trace over it and recreate the image without a white background. To find the same font style as the original, you can go to the original website, right click and select Inspect, and the font should be listed there. For this article, I'm going to recreate this in Photoshop since After Effects doesn't support underlining text. It's a sans serif font, and in Photoshop we can use Microsoft Sans Serif. In this example, I just copied the text from the website and made a new text layer. Played around with the font size and spacing between lines, lining everything up to a screenshot of the article underneath. You can highlight certain words and change their color and add an underline. Then I right click this text layer and export as a PNG. I can then add this to the After Effects composition. Next, we want to create this highlight effect. Select the pen tool, then click halfway down to the left of the first letter. You can hold shift and then click the end of the line. Holding shift makes sure the line is perfectly horizontal, otherwise you can just freehand click the second marker if you're working with text that's on an angle or something. You can adjust the stroke size at the top and change the color. To create the next highlights, you need to click off the layer or onto a blank spot, then click back onto the layer again. This will reset the pen tool and stop it from wrapping around onto the next line. Do this each time you need to create a new line. Now move this layer underneath the text. Then we can add a drop shadow from the effects panel onto the article text PNG layer. It's important to note this highlight is behind the text and isn't overlaid with a blend mode on top. Next, I create a new pen tool shape layer and make the color yellowy orange. This time we're going to animate it. Select the layer and select Add then Trim Paths, located at the top of the project to the right of the pen stroke setting. Or you can find this option again if you expand the layer and select Add Trim Paths from there. This will add a trim path drop down in the layer. Move the timeline to 2.5 seconds in, select End Stopwatch and make sure it's set to 0%. Then move to 3.2 seconds on the timeline and add another end marker set to 100%. We can then highlight those 2 keyframes and hit F9 to quickly smoothen this animation. For this layer, we're going to place it above the text and switch blend mode to screen. Then what I like to do is select all these layers, right click and select Pre-Compose. This is the same as nesting and makes it easier to adjust everything at once. It also stops the composition having too many layers. Unfortunately, in After Effects you can't have layers side by side. Next, we're going to recreate the graph directly in After Effects since we don't need to underline any text this time. I'm going to use the same graph found from Google Images and draw on top of it and line everything up to be the same. Using the pen tool, similar to how we created the highlight for the article, we can draw the lines. You can hold shift to get a straight line, make sure to click off the layer and back on to create a new separate line. Or you can just duplicate this layer 7 more times using Ctrl D. You can change the stroke size and color to white. Another tip is you can click off the layer and then click onto any of the endpoints if you need to adjust the length or position for whatever reason. Next, we'll pre-compose these layers into one nested layer and we can turn the opacity down to about 30% similar to Moon's graph. Then we'll create the number layers for both the X and Y axis. You can type the first number, hit enter, then the next number and do this for all of them. You can then align the text to the right or left and increase the spacing between lines on the paragraph settings window and do the same for the dates. And then you can rotate the dates -90 degrees and line it up using the same paragraph spacing spacing. Then you can easily type both the graph title and subtext. Once finished, you can pre-compose or nest all of these layers into one and label it graph. Now that we can see the layers on top of the background, we can add shadows to the layers to make it as close as possible to Moon's original clip. A tip I can give you is you can actually stack multiple drop shadow effects onto the same layer and play around with the settings and direction for each one. Next, we're going to enable the 3D setting for the graph, article, house, and background pattern. Then you can either right click in the blank space or go to layer at the top and select new camera. Now this is where the animation gets really tricky, and it's very difficult to copy Moon's animation exactly since we can't see his layers in 3D space, but we can recreate a pretty close copy. Basically, we're going to use a combination of the 3D camera as well as simple position keyframing. In fact, we want to use the 3D camera as little as possible and try to do a lot of it using position keyframing. The more you do with the 3D camera, the trickier it gets and can create incredibly complicated and wonky animations. First, we'll change the preview to 2 views. Select the second view and change it to left. Now we can line up the layers in 3D space with the article at the front, the graph behind and below it, and the house at the back. The first animation is making the house move up and scale. We use the scale keyframing here since it's a simple way of doing the animation compared to moving the camera, which would impact the other layers. This should hopefully give you a beginner introduction to 3D animation within After Effects. As you practice more and get better, then you can try do more with the camera. You can move this image either by sliding the blue numbers, or you can use the preview window and click and drag the green arrow to move the house up. Like always, you can highlight the keyframes and hit F9. And if you want, you can select the graph view and select either the position or scale, or select both at the same time, and you can manipulate the pacing of the transition. The first movement is a regular curve and the second movement slows down towards the end. To change these, you can select any point, which will reveal yellow handles, and if you click drag the yellow circles around, you can change the curve around. You can reposition the keyframes too. Here I set the second one at 0.57 seconds and the final keyframe at 2.53. Next, we'll do the same with the article layers, creating 2 keyframes making the article move up onto the center of the video. You can just hit F9 these keyframes for a smooth transition. The first keyframe begins before the last keyframe of the house is finished. I recommend doing this overlapping of layer motions as it creates a more smooth looking animation overall. Having multiple layers moving at the same time in 3D space looks a lot nicer, especially if you have them moving at different speeds. Then right as the article finishes moving, we're going to keyframe the camera's position. Before we do that, I recommend getting familiar with null objects and parent linking. Select layer, new, then null object. Enable 3D and drag the pick whip icon from the camera layer and drag it to the null layer. This creates a parent, and now we're going to control the camera by changing the null object values. It's not as important for this particular animation I'm doing today, but once you start doing more with the camera, creating multiple null objects will allow you to move the camera around a lot without the movement getting too clunky and uncontrollable. It means you can create separate curves that don't impact other curves. Whereas if you do multiple keyframes on one curve and change any one of them, it'll change the other curves and ruin the animation. You'll want to familiarize yourself with this technique. I've repositioned the null object to line up with the focus point of the camera rather than the camera itself. This will stop the camera swinging wildly. Then create a position keyframe at 2.42 seconds and then move to 3.53 seconds on the timeline and drag the null object closer to the article using the blue arrow on the preview window. Or if you want to do finer movements, hold down Control and slide the third or last blue numbers across to reposition it that way. Using the camera this way creates a zoom effect, making the article, house, and background pattern look like it's moving closer to the camera. Next, we're going to slide the null object down with the green arrow and slightly across and zoom in more with the other arrows. At the same time, at around 4.26 seconds, we're going to start moving the graph upwards into view, stopping at 6.12 seconds to create a second keyframe. Then back at 6.03 seconds, create a scale keyframe and scale the image up and put another keyframe at 8.41 seconds. For the next effect, go to the shadows background pattern layer, position it at the bottom left, create a keyframe, then go to the end of the timeline and move it diagonally to the top right as far as it'll go and create a second keyframe. This will create a moving shadow effect. Then create a black solid layer above the house layer and below the article layer. At 2.07 seconds, create an opacity keyframe, then at 2.52 seconds, turn the opacity down to 60%. And when we play the composition back, it's quite similar to Moon's. You can then go back to Premiere Pro and export it from there. Make sure you save the project on both programs. I know this video started to get a bit complicated, especially for beginners. I tried to keep it as simple as possible while covering a bit of everything. But if there's anything you need me to expand more on, let me know below. Thanks for watching, see you next time.